Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, March 23rd, day 534 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here in our Jerusalem office with our New York correspondent, Luke Tress. Hi, Luke. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
Such a pleasure to see you after all these years. And we're in Jerusalem, where protesters are gathering for the sixth consecutive day of demonstrations against the government's plans to dismiss Shin Bet Chief Ronen Bar and Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara. But today, we're going to turn our eyes to all things New York and the U.S. And Luke and I will speak about the high-profile tussle between the White House and Columbia University over sanctions against antisemitism on campus. We'll update you about the case of Mahmoud Khalil and other anti-Israel activists in the U.S.'s sights for deportation. And finally, Luke will tell us about some interesting efforts that U.S. Jews are turning to for self-protection, including Krav Maga classes and highly trained and highly expensive protection dogs. All this and much more when we're back. Columbia University has agreed to a series of changes demanded by the Trump administration as a precondition for restoring $400 million in federal funding that the government pulled this month over the school's handling of anti-Semitism on campus amid pro-Palestinian protests against Israel. So Columbia has acquiesced to most of the administration's demands, including restricting face masks on campus, empowering security officers to remove or arrest individuals, and taking away control of the department that offers courses on the Middle East from its faculty. So, Luke, you've been covering the anti-Israel protests since the war erupted on October 7th, 2023, when, of course, we need to remind, Hamas slaughtered 1,200 people in southern Israel and took another 250 hostage. So, Luke, do you think that these measures, and maybe specifically the restriction of face masks, will change even perhaps the intensity of the protests?
It's hard to say where the protests on Columbia campus are going. I mean, certainly the student protesters haven't said, we're going to stop protesting because there's these new rules. They've been pretty defiant. They're very angry at the university for agreeing to this stuff. So it's still unclear. And it's also unclear how the Trump administration is going to react, because Columbia just announced these new measures and the Trump administration hasn't commented yet. So it's unclear if it will be enough for them. It's unclear how it will affect protesters. So there's still a lot to be seen about where this is going from here.
It's not the first measures that Columbia has taken. And in fact, they announced, I think it was on March 14th, that they'd expelled and suspended and revoked the degrees of some student activists who forcibly took over a campus building last spring. We all remember those images for sure. And a campus coalition of anti-Israel groups, the Columbia University Apartheid Divest, claimed that 22 students had been sanctioned. Don't you think that the masking measures and the taking away the courses from the faculty in the Middle East studies and also sanctioning and expelling these students shows some kind of trend towards trying to tackle the anti-Semitism problem on campus?
Yeah, they're definitely trending in the direction of cracking down on these protests. There was a lot of frustration with them not doing much. Most people thought until this semester. So the trend is in that direction, but it's also still to be seen how all this is going to play out on the ground. Like, for instance, just reading through the Columbia statement, when they're talking about banning masks, there's some wiggle room in the wording there. It's like concealing one's identity in the commission of violation of university policies. It's this kind of wordy way of saying we're not going to allow masks. So it seems like how they're going to enforce it and what kind of masks won't be allowed, it's still a question. They're talking about reforming some disciplinary processes, but it's still to be seen how that will play out. So the trend is to cracking down on these more, but there's still a lot of questions about how all this is, like what actually is going to happen on the ground.
So I haven't been in the U.S. since, actually, unfortunately, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018. And I just don't know, are people walking around with masks these days like one did during the COVID pandemic?
No, it's really a protest thing. Like on the subway, you see people with masks here or there on flights, but people aren't masking in a widespread way. But the protesters are, and it's more keffiyehs than medical masks, and it's very deliberate on the part of the protesters, both at Columbia and elsewhere. Like a lot of times when these anti-Israel protest groups are putting out the advertisements for the protest, they will say like mask up. And sometimes they'll say stuff like COVID safe or something, but it's pretty clear it's about hiding your identity while you're at these protests. And like the Columbia protesters, for example, are very explicit about this. They'll say, in addition to telling people to wear masks, they'll say like, don't use your ID at Columbia right before the protest because they can track that. So the masking thing, it's a very deliberate thing by the protesters to conceal their identity.
So this year, it appears to have been a lot lower level than obviously what we saw in the spring. And a lot of the allegations surrounding the whole protest movement and the pushback against it has been surrounding freedom of speech, right? But we saw in the spring, of course, that it went way beyond speech, that there was, of course, destruction. And many Jewish students have alleged, at least, that they've felt unsafe, that there's been violence perpetrated against them as well. How do you see the balance of all of this playing out in terms of the safety of the Jewish students?
So the freedom of speech, like there's some things that are clearly covered by freedom of speech. If you say, I don't like Netanyahu, totally fine. Some things are totally beyond the pale, like smashing your way into a campus building. Even the like free speech groups will say that's clearly out of bounds. You can't break the law. You can't do stuff like this. But then there's some gray areas like targeted harassment is not covered by free speech protections. Incitement to imminent violence is not covered either. But there's gray areas there. Is it targeted harassment if you're yelling at Hillel about being a Zionist organization? Like Jewish students would say so, like the other people would say it's not. Is it incitement to imminent violence if you're handing out Hamas material on campus? Like there's differing opinions about this stuff. Like I think a lot of Jewish people would say it's threatening and harassing to hand out Hamas stuff, but free speech hardliners might say like that's covered. So that's one part of the free speech issue. The other part is that, as I think we've discussed on the podcast before, free speech protections are not the same as the laws for citizens and for non-citizens. There's a difference there. Like federal law says non-citizens can't espouse support for terrorism, while citizens can do that. So there's a lot of gray areas and there's some overlapping laws at play here. So a lot of room for interpretation and disagreement.
Okay, so this issue of citizen versus not citizen brings us to the case of Mahmoud Khalil, who was arrested. And he has been described by many as the spokesperson for the anti-Israel protests on Columbia, or the mastermind, or it's hard to know who he actually was in terms of that protest movement. But on March 8th, Khalil, who is a 30-year-old Columbia graduate student, or maybe even graduated as a graduate student, and he was the first to be detained by federal immigration agents as part of the U.S. President Donald Trump's crackdown on what he calls anti-Semitic and, quote, anti-American campus protests. So on Friday, Khalil appeared briefly in immigration court, and he's being held in Louisiana, which is obviously a different world than New York. He is, as I understand it, a green card holder, also married to U.S. citizen, and all eyes are on him. But there are at least two others who are in his category, as far as I understand it. One woman, I believe, who self-deported herself after her student visa was revoked or ran out, and another Palestinian who was actually detained. So in addition to these three who have been caught up in this new focus, are there others?
Yeah, one student, she was from India. She self-deported to Canada when she came under threat. The other one was arrested, but it was unclear when or if she had been a student. It seemed like she hadn't studied for a few years or something. So, yeah, Khalil's like the real clear-cut case of someone, a student activist being arrested in student housing. I mean, so he finished his studies in December, but hadn't done the graduation ceremony. So he was more of a graduate. But yeah, he's the real clear-cut case where a student, recognizable activist. He was a spokesperson and a negotiator for the protesters, so he had a forward role in the protest. So he's a clear-cut case of someone who was detained and is in deportation proceedings.
Now, in terms of the Jewish community, there are obviously those who are in support of President Trump's new efforts, especially those who perhaps are on campuses and feel the hatred every single day as they're walking to classes. But of course, there are others who, again, this free speech issue and the idea that a person can be arrested, deported, because of anti-Israel speech is very unsettling to many in the Jewish community. Where do you think the balance is? More with those who are upset by this action or more with those who are in support of it?
I don't know. I mean, there's no data about this, no surveys about this yet, so I don't want to speculate. But there's a lot there. I think a lot of people on both sides. Like, I mean, during the election, when I was reporting on stuff, a lot of people said like, we want to see deportations. We support Trump because he said he's going to deport these people, so we want to see deportations. So it's been an issue a lot of people support for a long time, and I think like a lot of people are happy about what they would see as Hamas supporting foreigners getting deported. I think a lot of people have no qualms about that. But yeah, there's issues including free speech, but also immigration rights and stuff. Like the Jewish community in the U.S. has historically been very pro-immigrant, and there's a fear about like deporting immigrants we don't like or blocking immigrants we don't like. So yeah, very, very, very divided. I would say a lot of people are ambivalent, and like a single person can be internally divided about this. So it's hard to say right now where I think the majority of people are.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. Obviously, Columbia University is only one campus. And Luke, you are covering all the campuses in New York and keeping an eye on all the campuses in general. And how would you characterize the atmosphere on, for example, the CUNY system, right? The City University of New York system, which has, what is it, 5 campuses in the city?
25.
25. I was a little
I believe
off.
20. I believe 25 different institutions. Yeah.
Okay, not a New Yorker, so sorry about that. But of course, that's not necessarily where the Jews flock to, but obviously because New York is such a hugely Jewishly populated city, I think you said earlier 12% of the city is Jewish, they're definitely feeling the hatred as well. So what are you seeing on the 25 other campuses?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to generalize. I think Columbia's been a focus for a lot of reasons, including that it's like the big Ivy League school of New York. It's also has a campus, which like NYU, for example, there's not like a big one with a campus where people can go to protest. So it's like, I think there's a lot of factors making Columbia the focus, but
meaning, because again, I'm not a New Yorker, Columbia has an actual like compound that's a campus, whereas NYU is just some buildings where classrooms are. Is
yeah,
that
NYU is dispersed in a lot. It's kind of like an area, but the buildings are all dispersed. While Columbia has like a big lawn in the middle of campus where protesters can go. So There's been protests at NYU, but they're kind of like dispersed. They're on sidewalks or some people in a library or something, and then they can't do something like take over a lawn in the middle of campus like they did at Columbia.
Got it. Oh, that makes so much sense. And of course, Columbia also has sister universities or brother universities, Barnard, etc. And that's part of the compound feeling.
Yeah, I mean, Barnard has kind of its own campus. There's other stuff like the Hillel is like a little bit off campus, so there's some like dispersal. And then another thing about that is Columbia has to call police onto campus. So at NYU or these other campuses, police like the NYPD is there because they're on public property. So the colleges have less control. Like there's been protests at CUNY campuses that saw like outright support for terrorism, people with Hamas headbands and stuff. And I asked the CUNY colleges about it, and they say like it's not our property. It's public property. We don't even know they're wearing masks. We don't even know if they're actually students. So like their hands are very tied about what they and they're right. Like they can't arrest people who are on public property who they don't even know if they're students. So
Whereas Columbia is a closed campus and you need to have a student ID to get onto the campus.
yeah, it's a closed campus, and so it's been closed to non-ID holders since I forget when, but it's like a long time in the war. It used to be open to the public, but now it's closed. So yeah, they can control access. They have their own security officers. They have to call police onto campus, so they have a lot more control about what's going on their property.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense that the campus itself is being targeted for not sanctioning these people because really the only body that can sanction them is the university itself. But are you hearing from other Jewish students at the CUNY system who do feel unsafe at this point, or is it more of a Columbia problem?
No, it's not only a Columbia problem. I mean, the CUNY system, even that is hard to generalize because, like we said, dozens of institutions, something like 250,000 students, something like that. And some campuses are more Jewish, some campuses are less Jewish. There's most of them are also not residential campuses; they're commuter campuses. So another thing at Columbia is like the Jewish students are living in dorms with the anti-Israel protesters, which makes things more difficult. I've talked to Jewish students at CUNY campuses, and it's similar stuff. Like some of them feel very ostracized. After October 7th, they felt nobody sympathized with them. There's tensions with Muslim student groups and pro-Palestinian groups on campus. Like early in the war at Queens College, which is a CUNY school, they tried to get the Jewish and Muslim student groups in a room together to talk about what was happening, and it blew up. Like shouting, like very bitter, like really didn't work out. Other CUNY campuses have told me there's kind of a cold war between different student groups. There have been really extreme protests. There's extreme stuff on social media, like terrorist support and stuff like this. So I think the atmosphere is not as intense as Columbia, but a lot of the same tensions are still there on a lot of these campuses.
And on the New York streets themselves, you were telling our staff earlier in an editorial meeting about how in your neighborhood, in the Upper West Side, the posters for the hostages are being defaced and there's anti-Israel rhetoric just being spray painted around. So that leads us to our final topic. You have written in many different ways about how U.S. Jews and New Yorkers specifically are searching for ways to protect themselves in this very tense atmosphere. One of the ways is, of course, Krav Maga. Our time is short now, so I would like to focus on a different way in an article that we published just over the weekend, which focuses on why some people, mostly Jews, are spending even $125,000 for a protection dog.
Yeah, so this is, I would say, like a niche security measure in the broader trend of Jewish people seeking security. But there is this Israeli company called Israel Protection Canine that is training these highly trained dogs. They're basically military or police grade protection dogs and selling them to mostly wealthy Jewish people. Like now the price is $75 to $125,000. The numbers are small. They've sold a couple dozen. They have 45 something in training now. Numbers small, but it seems like there's a lot of interest in this. They're getting a lot of inquiries. So yeah, this is like some people go to, do some free Krav Maga classes to feel more safe. And on the other end of the spectrum, people are investing in these very expensive dogs. But it's not just protection. Like people also want to feel connected to Israel with these dogs. Like the dogs' commands are in Hebrew, so it's like their kids are learning Hebrew by talking to the dog. And also, like the people I talked to who had these dogs are really very attached to the dogs. It's not like a working dog that it's not a pet. Like they are pets. They're very deeply attached. They're very connected to these dogs. So it's a big investment, but it's also, I think, has a lot of payoff for the people who are doing it.
No, it's just fascinating because in reading your piece, of course, one of the owners said that the dog is probably on the couch right now next to my wife watching Netflix, right? But you think, wow, such a major investment into something that is meant to not just guard you. It's not just guarding, it's protecting. So tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I didn't know much about these kind of dogs before, but they're very impressive. Like the company has videos out of the dogs, and just the athleticism and the obedience is just really, really impressive. Like, my family growing up, we had dogs, and we taught them to sit. that was about it. You don't really think about what dogs are capable of until you see these dogs. And yeah, the way they describe it is like their kids love playing with the dogs. Like one person told me, my little daughter uses the dog as a pillow, and it's they come to work with me and they're so well behaved and people pet them. But also when you give the command, it's like switch flips. You see they're very highly trained and responsive and very capable and also very smart. This is what everyone else told me also. Like they're very intelligent dogs. Like the guy in the article, we have one guy, his daughter's in a parking lot and an adult is approaching the daughter. And the dog is calculating if this is a threat or not. And it turned out it was the daughter's Hebrew teacher. It wasn't a threat. But he said, I could see the dog watching this man approach my daughter. And the dog is watching and the dog is looking at me for instructions. And you can, like, the dog is putting together the pieces in its head of, do I take action or not? And then he said, like, yeah, I just told the dog to lay down and it was fine. But like, these are very intelligent dogs that make decisions about stuff. So yeah, very, very interesting seeing these kind of highly trained dogs going into just regular family homes.
It's amazing to me, really. Luke, thank you so much for joining me today in our Jerusalem office.
Yep, thank you. And yeah, good to be here.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, Shalom.